Are the Sooners getting better? A look at the spring sessions that conclude with the big spring game coming up on Saturday in Norman, and recruiting and transfer portal. Get used to it. That's always the talk, always needs to be the talk. That's the lifeblood of college football, of course, recruiting, and then add on the college football equivalent of free agency. It is here. The window is open, and there are all sorts of speculations and leans out there to discuss right here at Sooners Live, right here at the Voice of College Football. Appreciate you being here. Leave those comments and questions there in the live chat. Consider contributing to the channel, to the show. The super chat is available to you. And of course, we got Jason right here to answer our comments and questions for edition 109. Jason, appreciate you being here.
Yeah, glad to be here as always, Mark. Appreciate you having me.
All right. Well, we can start out with what we know, and that's that Kelly Daniels committed this week. My approach to these commitments on the team channels that we have is to do some type of thumbnail or profile, quick look, 3 or 4 minutes. And I looked at him and I searched around, and I'm either looking for rankings and ratings from 247 Sports, or I'm looking for stats on Max Preps or some other source. Yeah. And I just didn't find out a whole lot about Kelly Daniels.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot out there about him, I think, Martin, just for the general public. I've heard that he goes by KJ Daniels, so that's one thing I've heard. But yeah, I mean, on the smaller side, really kind of a smaller, quicker, twitchy speed guy, 5'10", 150, which is obviously a little bit small. But I think if I remember right when Hollywood Brown came to Oklahoma, he was somewhere in the neighborhood of 130, 135. So not that big of a deal from a size perspective. But yeah, no, I think from who I've talked to, what I've heard is he's a guy that will probably be a fairly high 3-star once the composite rankings come out for him. Mark, I think he certainly has the opportunity to potentially be a low 4-star, but again, I think the recruiting prowess of Emmett Jones and some of his inroads that he has, although this kid's from Louisiana, but still, some of the inroads that he has in the Texas area is proving to be fruitful, and not only him, but we'll talk about another kid as well. But yeah, no, I think he's a guy that Emmett Jones was probably in on previously at Texas Tech, and so he's a guy that committed pretty quickly in the process and the discussion with discussions with Oklahoma, and like you said, it's no statistics, so it really doesn't know it from a ranking perspective. So it really doesn't do anything from a overall team ranking, but for Oklahoma. But it's good to see these commits start trickling in for OU now.
I'm seeing something on Max Preps, which is mighty confusing. Maybe they need to organize their statistics categories a little bit better. But it's a Franklinton football stats, and this is from 2021. So I don't even know if it's worth trying to recite and decipher through. But Kelly Daniels, 33 yards per game in receiving and 23 yards per game rushing. That's what I can make out of that. And 7 total touchdowns during his sophomore season. Apparently, if those are updated and accurate and correct for KJ Daniels in Louisiana high school football. All right, so we will see if he develops. And certainly the transfer portal opened almost 1 week ago, 6 days ago. Bear Alexander was that first guy that people started really talking about because he was the top 50 recruit when he came out. So that ranking is still with a lot of football people, a lot of fans that say, hey, go grab this guy. We remember him being one of the most sought after players in America just a year and a half ago. And then on top of that, he threw around Max Duggan a couple times in the national championship game for a couple tackles for loss. Yeah. And that stood out. And now Bear Alexander is out there. There's a little bit of hope, but maybe not a lot.
Yeah, Mark, NIL is a big factor in this one. So I think, and if you go back from an Oklahoma perspective, and under the previous defensive regime, Oklahoma recruited him pretty heavily um, out of high school, so he's got a little bit of. He already has a little bit of comfortability, I think, with that staff over at USC, and as I mentioned, the NIL is making is a big factor here. So I would say that USC at this point has a considerable lead. Oklahoma's in the mix along with some others, but yeah, I think it just depends. I mean, Oklahoma's willing to play the game. I mean, they'll play the NIL game. Just kind of depends on how far they're willing to go, and if it's just about NIL, or if it's partially about being developed, and those other situations. So, I mean, it's one to keep an eye on for sure. I think, Mark. It's not like Oklahoma's not in the running here, and that's a position that you've got to, in the words of Brandon Drum, you've got to play ball. You've got to play. You've got to, express the interest. And so there's tons of interest from Oklahoma side, and I think there's some interest from the Bear Alexander camp. Now, again, it just kind of depends on how far Oklahoma's willing to go. So we'll see how that continues to go as well. But Oklahoma's going to continue to be active here in the transfer portal, and on a couple of guys, and as this kind of period goes forward post spring game.
Texas lost, and when we say lost, of course, if you hit the transfer portal, there is that slim chance that that player or that team will decide to take them back. But that happens very rarely, but we've seen it. So 90-some% chance plus that Texas has lost 3 players through the transfer portal that were announced today, including one wide receiver who was a top 20 prospect in the state of Texas, top 20 wide receiver in the 22 class, 131 in the composite, caught one pass for Texas last year, 32 yards, and that's Brennan Thompson, who obviously has some high-end ability.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's a speed guy, really in the same mold that we talked about KJ Daniels a little bit, but obviously much, I think probably a lot more prolific in high school, and very, as you mentioned, very highly regarded in that 2022 cycle. So, yeah, I think Oklahoma's the team to beat here. Oklahoma holds, from everything I've heard, holds a significant advantage in this one. I think Texas Tech is in the mix. TCU's in the mix. I think Oklahoma has reworked his visit to Oklahoma this weekend so he can be here for the spring game. So wouldn't it all be surprised to see him? Wouldn't it all be surprised to see him possibly commit to Oklahoma after this weekend? But would not expect this to go more than 5 to 7 days at the max. And so, yeah, I mean, and I think this is another area we've talked about as we talked about some of the wide receivers in Oklahoma's room right now. A lot of good players, but not quite certain if they have a guy that is going to who's going to be that Marvin Mims guy who's going to be able to stretch the field consistently. And so, this guy's a different level of wide receiver that Oklahoma has had in kind of the mold of a Hollywood Brown and the mold of a Jalen Saunders, really quick, twitchy guy. So we'll see how that goes. I think Oklahoma has much more to probably offer than what than what Texas Tech or TCU probably has to offer right now, just in terms of, whether it be immediate playing time or whether it be just resources that the University of Oklahoma could provide. So, I think that'll be a big add. Again, he's another guy, Mark, and not to say that, if he commits to Oklahoma, like he's a guaranteed starter. Like, as you mentioned, he played in 9 games last year, had 1 catch for 32 yards. So didn't really, as a true freshman, didn't produce, but I think he has the ability to. So I think it's, again, would be something that just bolsters that room, maybe much more than it is right now.
Appreciate you all being here at the Voice of College Football for our Oklahoma show coming your way on a Thursday this week. So please, what you need to do is subscribe and turn on the notifications to know when we go live. And appreciate everyone being here. And for those that you watch us on the record, welcome in. Try to catch us live. It's a little bit more fun, more interactive, and we take your comments and questions. All right, we can move on to the spring game. In addition to everything else going on, of course, the spring game is where fans will overreact, and I get it. I understand. I think that the way to look at it is that practice, scrimmage, game, whatever you want to call it, and everybody approaches it a little bit differently. There are teams that I saw last weekend, like Michigan State and Florida State, that pretty much just run drills.
Right.
And they run a lot of just situations. And again, you see players going through drills, and then you see it all the way to something close to a game. Georgia was pretty competitive out there in Clemson in tackling everything besides a quarterback. So there are variations of it. And I understand people over responding to it because it's the one time you get to see any of the players and game situations and all of that. So it needs to be taken into context that, okay, it's only 1 out of 15. The other 15 sessions or 14 sessions are just as important. And there are things going on that actually, from a strategic standpoint, are more important because they're behind closed doors. However, it is the one time we get to see everyone. So it's the 1 out of 15. So about whatever you want to say, that 5% of the time, 5% of the evaluation, but it's the only one that we get. Even the media goes out there and they will let you know it's helpful for them to be out there on the field and to see 10 or 15 minutes or 30 minutes. It depends on the team, of course. But usually it's a lot of stretching and a lot of warm-ups, and they just gives them kind of a feel for who's in what group with whom. It's not necessarily an evaluation where they can really see things, but they will get a scrimmage or two look at times, again, depending on the school. But here we go with Saturday, and Sooners fans look at a team that went 6-7 last year and to see if they've gotten better.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. And I think the spring games are always very, very intriguing to me for many of the reasons that you'd mentioned. There's always an overreaction to something that you see there. But there's also things that could be leading indicators in terms of what could happen. I remember a couple of years ago, everyone was kind of in awe watching exactly how well Caleb Williams performed in that spring game for Oklahoma. And, I think a lot of people thought, yeah, this kid has a chance to be really, really good, but, it'll be a year or so down the line. And then, what happened. And then there always seems to be, especially at Oklahoma, there always seems to be a kid that is, a walk-on or is not really highly, regarded coming into the spring game that has just a monster spring game. And I think everybody kind of expects, something big out of that player, and then nothing really materializes. So, yeah, I think you're right. And I think from a coach's perspective, I think it's the good part of this is, number one, I think it's a good opportunity to see how some of these kids react in a game-like situation. Sure, they have scrimmages and things like that, but you have a game-like situation in front of, I think, Oklahoma's probably expecting anywhere between 60 and 70,000 people there this year. And so, how they react when the lights are on, so to speak, how they react when, especially newer kids that haven't played a whole lot. So that's, I think that's impactful. But I think, to your point, the evaluations in the other practices that Oklahoma or any team has had throughout the balance of the spring probably tells a little bit more than maybe what one single performance might take. And it's a little bit it's kind of interesting. Me and you talked about this I believe it was last week or a couple of weeks ago, about the opportunity at some point for some of these teams to actually play another team in the spring. And I know you've been paying attention to it. I have. There's been several coaches that have come out and really talked about that this spring, about something that I think they would like to see. And so we'll see how that goes. But yeah, I mean, I think like you, I've watched some of the spring games, and it's hard to it's always hard to get a good idea. Now you look at Georgia and you're just like your jaw drops to a certain degree, and the athleticism and just how good, how talented that roster is, on one perspective. And then you watched Florida a little bit, and you're like, man, they looked, they didn't look strong early on. So you have that to a certain degree at all, at all programs. And so I think what some of these spring games have turned into, Mark, at some of these bigger schools, it's a gigantic recruiting weekend for everybody. Now that you can have visits, unofficial and official, here during the spring game. A lot of people do. Oklahoma's having the statue unveiling for Kyler Murray this year, which they had Baker Mayfield last year. So that's an opportunity to get some fans, and so I think just to create excitement within the program more so than the spring game itself, because there's a lot of things that they that they don't do. And I think from Oklahoma's perspective, Oklahoma's been fairly dinged up through the spring, and there's been certain times where, with scrimmages and things like that, that they've had to do some patchwork types of things. Like I think they only had six healthy scholarship offensive linemen this past week. And so it's nothing serious. It's just and I wouldn't say typical, but there's some dings and just small little injuries. That's not gonna be incredibly impactful as the season goes on. But I think the other thing is, a lot of these coaches are nervous about injuries. I mean, you've always had the protection for the quarterback, and now you're seeing some protection for other players on the field. And so I think it's just an opportunity to create excitement. And as you mentioned, it's fans and media's one for many programs. I know that Venables keeps practice open, a few of them for the media and things like that. But by and large, it's the only opportunity for people to see their team play in the entire spring, up until opening day, first kickoff of the year. So no, I think like I said, like you said, there's always going to be at every spring game, there's always going to be a little bit of an overreaction to something, and maybe there's an underreaction to something that happens that doesn't seem like it'll be a big deal, but it turns out it ends up being a bigger deal than what it looked like in the spring. So yeah, it'll be very entertaining to watch for sure.
Again, it's an indication. So we all know that we have good days and bad days at work. And for these guys, of course, they're competing against other athletes. So they really can have good days and bad days at work, because they've got somebody trying to keep them from having a good day. So again, we need to back off on the overreaction. At the same time, typically when guys are struggling, that's going to show up. They probably, if somebody gets burned on 3 or 4 routes, they probably have been doing that for the last 14 practices. Or if, whatever their role or skill set of their position, there's a high likelihood that whatever they're showing in the spring game is what they've been showing for the last 15 practices. But we don't know that for sure, but you can draw some conclusions. I think that I probably made this comment before about spring games, that the line play, I think it's more about looking at individual players and to see if they look good.
Yeah.
But to measure the offensive line against the defensive line, first of all, the offensive line has the luxury of not having to deal with too much thrown at them by way of blitzes and
Mhm.
other things. So they've got a huge advantage of just the defensive line, just man on man coming at them. Maybe they'll throw in some stunts. I don't know, but it's just they don't have to do the cerebral aspect of what's given to an offensive line, which after the quarterback, they have more thinking to do than anybody else out there in terms of picking things up, being in sync and combination and coordination with each other. But then the other thing you don't know, unless you're really paying attention or the staff has revealed this prior to the spring game, and that's what kind of line combinations you have, because the team obviously has to field two teams. So sometimes Clemson took the approach last week, ones on ones, twos on twos,
Mhm.
although they were missing three starting offensive line. So then there's that. So uh, you can't get a real good feel again. I don't think for the line play is kind of difficult. One stat throw completely out the window are sacks,
Yeah.
because that is the most overdriven stat by the rules. You get a fingernail on a cleat and the guy's down. And so we know that these quarterbacks are going to get probably 75% of the sacks that I see probably weren't going to be sacks.
Right.
I watched some of the Auburn spring game a couple of weeks ago, and they've got a running quarterback in Robbie Ashford. So they're constantly running a read option type play. He's keeping it, and you have no idea if this is going to be a successful play under standard rules, because somebody gets a fingernail on him every time, and it looks like he might have broken that for 40 yards. So you have no idea really what the success of these plays are. So again, I tend to focus on individual players. I also tend to focus on the thought that, and I don't know if this is right thinking or not, it is to me, that wide receivers and defensive backs are in space, and that's as similar to a game as anything on the field that I can think of. It's a one-on-one competition in space. And so what we see out there is exactly what it would be in a game, to see who's winning those battles in the passing game.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Mark. I think, and then there's the old adage, and I think that probably still rings true that early on, especially in the spring, the defense is probably ahead of the offense a little bit. Just and I think both sides are going to be very vanilla. Obviously, not just at Oklahoma, but any of these spring games are going to be very vanilla, and they don't want to certainly show everything or really anything, from that perspective. But so yeah, I think that you hit it spot on. It's really hard, especially if you have a dual threat quarterback. It's hard to see. It's hard to kind of get a real good feel for what that run game looks like with if anyone's getting close to the quarterback, they're going to whistle it down. But I think the and both sides are going to be very familiar. I mean, they're running against each other all spring, and they know the offense. The offense knows the defense, and so there's a lot of familiarity there, that that certainly will be there. And so yeah, no, I think when you look at the big area, I think for Oklahoma is kind of on the defensive side, looking at the linebackers and the defensive backs in space, and to your point, the wide receivers. And it just so happens, I think those are the areas for Oklahoma that there's the biggest, I don't know if question mark is the right word, but there's the most discussion. There's the most intrigue. I think Oklahoma, people probably feel pretty good about the offensive line, probably feel pretty good about the depth and what we've got, and what Oklahoma has coming back from a defensive line perspective. But the wide receivers are very unproven. Defensive backs are, again, tons and tons of talent, which we can get into, but still unproven, as well. So I think that works out, I think, perfectly for Oklahoma and the evaluation area there.
Jason, I'm going to throw out this question because I don't know where he's going with this exactly. Robert's asking, he says, with Daniels, possibility of Brennan Thompson, is there a possibility that Wesco may look elsewhere?
I don't think so. Bryant Wesco, 5-star wide receiver that Oklahoma, a big one that Oklahoma's in on. I don't know that. Particularly Daniels. I don't think either of those two kids would do anything to scare Wesco away, in my opinion. Um, he's a big time receiver. Wesco is a guy that will probably wherever he goes will get some early playing time, and he's got the look, as Ryan mentioned, as a more big body, big time receiver. So no, don't really. I like where Oklahoma's at with him. By the way, I think Oklahoma's in a really good spot with Wesco, but again, I don't see him as a guy that would be threatened as a 5-star. Most 5-stars aren't going to come in and be threatened by anyone really. I think most of them will thrive on the competition and look forward to the competition. But no, I don't think that will or would have any impact at all on Wesco.
The one exception may be quarterback. It's just a different position. There's only one guy that plays. Every other position, shoot.
Absolutely.
4 and 5 wide receivers in a rotation and every other position, multiple guys playing. So even the 5-star quarterbacks may take that into consideration, as we see typically 2 of them don't go to the same school. All right. As we transition from some of the positions you hit on for the spring game, linebackers and defensive backs, I will throw one thought out there that some people may want to shut their ears off to, but it just ran through my mind when you mentioned guys that have flashed in spring games in the past, and you brought up the name Caleb Williams, and I thought, I wonder how many issues Caleb Williams would have masked last year. I wonder how much he would have made up for. And I don't have the answer to that question. Nobody does. We will never know. But those are the kind of things I sometimes enjoy considering, what kind of difference would that have made?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of conversations, Mark, that we have, whether it be me and you or just a lot of people, inside the program, or just talking about this Oklahoma season last year, and the fact of, and really where it comes down to is the comparisons that Dylan Gabriel has had, right? And he's a kid that, again, I'll say this over and over again. Really good quarterback. I think had a really good year for Oklahoma, but the expectations are off the charts for quarterback play at Oklahoma. So Dylan Gabriel is a guy that needs some support. He needs, whether it be defensive support or needs offensive line support, good wide receiver. He needs a lot of support for him to be a really good difference maker. Whereas to your point that you're making, that you've got guys that Oklahoma has had in the past, and specifically Caleb Williams, that you'd mentioned, that has the ability to put a team on his back, and I'll go win this game, and he's a guy that makes everyone around him better, in the same mold as a Baker Mayfield, a Kyler Murray, Jalen Hurts, all of those people. So to answer your questions, Oklahoma had I believe it was 4 games that that Oklahoma lost by one possession, less than one possession. So 7 points or less. And so, you have to think that at the very least, Oklahoma wins half of those with someone. So, and maybe even more. And I may be wrong by the number, but I feel like it was 4 that was within one possession, because there was you've got the maybe 5 counting the bowl game. But you've only got the 2 blowouts that Oklahoma had to Texas and TCU, and the rest of them, the losses were very extremely competitive in nature. So I think as you look at that, Oklahoma could have easily won 2 or 3 of those, and that was the difference, honestly, Mark, between last year and the year before. Oklahoma won all those close games the year before, and they didn't win any of them last year. And I think it's fair to say, not a complete reflection of the quarterback position, but Oklahoma was a little bit worse defensively than most people thought they would be last year, and I mean that was the contributing factor. But yeah, I mean I think this team probably wasn't. I mean a 9-3 team, maybe an 8-4 team with Caleb Williams at quarterback.
If you include the bowl game, 5
Yep.
one-score games that were lost. And in addition to that, I'm looking at the scores and recalling situations. I look at this Iowa State game that they lost 27-13. I remember going through that game and going through the extended highlights. That was 20-13. And Oklahoma had some kind of turnover at midfield or on the plus side, or they could have mounted a drive with 3 or 4 minutes left to tie the game. So there's a 2-score game that was very much in doubt with 2 or 3 minutes left. So yeah, it was definitely out there. I got to say that Caleb Williams, before we move on to more Oklahoma analysis, he played a game against Notre Dame last year that, not from the standpoint of passing, even from the standpoint of breaking, contain, and running for positive yards, but from the standpoint of extending plays, it was one of the best games I've ever seen a quarterback play. Just because he's so big, for one thing. Notre Dame's pass rush was relentless. They were chasing him all over the field. They had him pinned in. They had him sacked. They had him and he was ducking guys. He was bouncing off guys. He was eluding guys, dodging guys in every conceivable way, and just frustrating them to no end, and then delivering throws. You would see him in situations that you would know 90% of the time, nobody's making a play here. The best they're going to do is to throw the ball away, and he's turning it into a 22-yard completion down the field. So yeah, it's just again, there's a difference between a guy that's a really capable, good, solid starting quarterback and a guy that can just 4 or 5 times a game, or whatever the situation calls for, can turn a negative into a positive.
Yeah, no, yeah, you're absolutely right, Mark. And we always kind of, and I'm not going to speak for everyone from an Oklahoma fan standpoint, but I'll speak for myself. I don't think there's anywhere near the same angst with Caleb Williams as there was with Lincoln Riley. I think a lot of people thought that Caleb Williams did everything the right way. He finished the season off. He played in the bowl game. He went and he decided to go and to do what he thought was best for himself and his career. Excuse me, at USC. And so I don't think there's a lot of people that, at least from my perspective, have as much of a problem with that. And yeah, he is I hate to use this term, because anytime you use it, then you just have someone that's going to be able to be there next. But the generational talent, but he's one of those. He's just an excellent football player. Sure, he'll be, if he's not the number 1 pick in next year's draft, he'll be very, very high, a very, very high draft pick next year. So yeah, absolutely, without a doubt.
Talking Sooners with all of you each and every week live. So we appreciate when people can make it to the live show, because we love the interaction, taking the comments and questions from you. But if you can't, certainly the record's there for you. And if you join us live and you get in a little bit late, keep in mind that you can catch what you missed once the video posts, which is seconds after we are done with the live stream. I would have to say, unless I'm missing somebody, Jason, that Deshaun White would be the biggest loss from last season on the linebacking core as we kind of size up the linebackers and the defensive backs here?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think he is. He'll be the one that is missed the most, without a doubt. But I think there's a lot. There's a lot of young talent. There's a lot of guys that have contributed in a big way for Oklahoma. I think a couple of the guys that you look at that have that really last year that played really well. Danny Stutzman, I think, is the guy that that a lot of people and some of the talk is he can be an All-American. He has the opportunity. He has the skill set. He has the talent to be an All-American. Now, can he put it? Can he completely put it all together? And so, second year under Venables and staff, you would think that he takes that step up. From a linebacker perspective, Jaron Kanek is another one that didn't play a ton, played a little bit last year, played a couple of different positions, still completely learning how to be how to be a linebacker, I should say. And I think there's a lot of expectations out of him. He's a guy that probably is one of your starters at the linebacker position as well. A couple of other guys to kind of keep your eye on for Oklahoma that have made some noise here early on. Kobe McKenzie, very highly recruited kid. I think a lot of people remember him as he was a guy that was committed to the previous staff at Oklahoma, decommitted for a couple of days, and then reaffirmed his commitment. Has had an excellent offseason, has had a really, really good spring. He's a guy that keep your eye on, buy some stock into him. Shane Witter is another guy. Shane Witter and Kip Lewis are a couple other guys there to keep your eye on for Oklahoma as well. Shane Witter has a lot of speed. Really has just had problems just being able to stay healthy. Without a doubt. But I think he's a guy that could potentially be in the mix. We've mentioned Deshaun White. David Agwebu is another guy that left that was very had some holes in his game for sure, but he's a guy that has made a lot of plays for Oklahoma over the last couple of years, particularly last year, 109 tackles, as you see on the screen here. But and then the other one that Phil Picciotti is a true freshman. I don't know that he's going to do enough to be able to get into the rotation as a true freshman, but he's a guy that really has a ton of upside, looks really good, really filled out as a true freshman for Oklahoma. So I think overall, I think that you like the depth and you like where you're at from Oklahoma's perspective, and at the linebacker position, just need obviously more consistency. I think they have. When you look at Kobe McKenzie, when you look at Jaron Kanek, and when you look at Danny Stutzman, you've got three guys that are extremely, extremely talented, but still has to put it together. And as Jimmy had mentioned here in the chat, Stutzman is really the only one that has a lot of experience. A lot of these guys are inexperienced, and that's really it's almost like a broken record, Mark. We almost say this in almost every single position for Oklahoma. They've got a lot of young talent. I think I saw a stat yesterday that said, and of course you take stats how it is, but Oklahoma only has one returning player, not even a starter, in that top 22 on the offensive defensive side of the ball from 2 years ago. So this roster has had a complete makeover, a complete turnover. So I think they certainly like we'll get into on the defensive backs, love their talent that they have here, but still it's unproven, but has the opportunity to be really good.
Talking Oklahoma football with the spring game just 2 days away in Norman, and looking at the defensive side of the ball in the back seven with Jason, looking at the linebackers, looking at the DBs, and your thoughts about a group that got torched way too many times last year.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just very very briefly, I'm sorry, Mark, before we go there, and should have my hand slapped for not even mentioning this kid. Deshaun McCullough, the transfer is going to be a guy that, it's going to be interesting to see. I think they like him a little bit in that cheetah position. I think he's at Oklahoma. He'll be asked to do a little bit more in coverage than he was previously at Indiana in terms of what he was really really good at rushing the passer. So we'll see where he finds a home, but he'll absolutely be in the mix. And I think right now he's probably the leading candidate to get there via the cheetah position. But going back, going forward, I should say, to the DBs, very very similar, very similar conversation here. You have a lot of have a lot of talent. I think more so at the cornerback position. Jaden Davis, who was, I think a lot of people, he started a few games last year. Um, and I think a lot of people, in terms of experience, thought he was the guy that could be one of the starters this year. Hit the transfer portal earlier this week, or maybe it was late last week, I should say. So you've got Woody Washington as your clear shutdown number one corner. Is a guy that considered leaving, but ultimately chose to come back and stay. So you've got just tons of competition, Mark, at that other cornerback position. I think Kendall Dolby, the junior college transfer from Northeastern Oklahoma and A&M, is a guy to really really watch. I think he probably would potentially be the starter if OU happened to, open the season tomorrow. He's a guy that to keep your eye on the corner from a cornerback perspective. I think Gentry Williams is another guy who has, he had a kind of a scary potential heart condition situation. It ended up he's been cleared over the last couple of weeks. He's a guy that they love his talent. They love his aggressiveness at the cornerback position. Would be in the mix. You kind of want to say Kenai Walker is a guy that could get in that mix, but haven't really heard a ton about him this spring. Has had a lot of different like small injuries, things like that. That's not really been able to, um, allow to kind of keep him in the mix and keep him in the game, or in practice, I should say. And then you've got some younger kids that are, really really playing well early on. A couple of freshmen, Josiah Wagner. Really big time recruit, Makari Vickers. Both of these kids have played really, really well. So again, those are a couple of guys that are very young, and so I think you've got about 4 or 5 guys that are going to end up, competing, vying for that role. And I think anytime you see a guy that's almost a projected starter hit the transfer portal, you think, okay, we've got, Oklahoma's probably going to have to go to the portal, but I think they like who they have there at corner. And I think the writing was on the wall. Jay Davis hit the portal because he probably wasn't going to be a starter and may not have been in the two deep when it came down to it. And then when you move to the safety position, I think you've got Billy Bowman, who I think has continued to make strides each and every year. Mark, I think he's this is his junior year. He started as a true freshman, um, and then was much better last year uh, for Oklahoma. He has another opportunity. It's much like very very similar to the conversation that you have about Danny Stutzman. Has the opportunity to be an All-American there in that position, and it will be interesting to see how he grows as he gets a little older, a little bit more experience as a junior, and he's counted on to be to be one of those guys. And so and you look there, he's a guy that you have again very much penciled in as a starter you can almost put that in marker like he's going to be one of your safeties. I think the other one will be interesting to see how that goes. I think the leader in the clubhouse is Texas Tech transfer Reggie Pearson, has played, has played at Wisconsin. I think he played at Texas, obviously played at Texas Tech. Really big hitter for Texas Tech last year. Really put a big time hit on Dylan Gabriel at one point in the season. So when Oklahoma played, so he's a guy. Peyton Bowen, we've talked about him. I think the kid's going to be too good to keep off the field. He's going to be. I mean, I don't think he's going to be a kid that's going to start. From everything I heard, but he's going to be one of your backups at the safety, probably backing up. Billy Bowman is probably going to get some time. Kind of one of those things remains to be seen. If it's one of those things where he'll just get his 4 games and Oklahoma will be able to redshirt him, or it will be another situation where he has the opportunity to be a big factor, and they just can't afford to redshirt him, type of situation. So Justin Harrington, you continue to hear just great things about him over the last couple of years. Even played a little bit more last year. Again, is working himself into potentially being in that mix as potentially part of that cheetah role, or maybe even in a safety spot. But I think, and then you've got a guy like Jaden Rowe who's been injured a little bit. We'll see how that. So I think Oklahoma has a lot of depth going into it. I think the secondary has an opportunity to be one of the strongest units, but they've got a lot of young kids. If they can get those guys going, and some of the transfers as we mentioned with Kendall Dolby at the cornerback position, and then Reggie Pearson at the safety position, this has an opportunity to be a really, really good and deep secondary for Oklahoma this year.
Got a question coming in from Michael Rose, who's asking about the chances that Jackson Arnold redshirts this year.
I think that is very much the desire, Mark. I think that is the desire from everything I've heard. I don't think. I mean, they're not going to be. I think Oklahoma, the coaching staff and the general feel is they're not going to be in dire straits if something were to happen to Dylan Gabriel and Jackson Arnold, much like they were last year. But I think they're in a spot where they don't. At this point, it's not one of the things where he's probably going to unseat Dylan Gabriel as it stands right now. It could happen. We have these situations if Dylan Gabriel struggles. I mean, you just have to go back a couple of years ago, Mark, to look at when Spencer Rattler struggled. The fans were adamant about wanting Caleb Williams to get an opportunity. So if we go into the season and Dylan Gabriel is starting to struggle in any way, shape, or form, then people are going to be clamoring for a Jackson Arnold. But I think the desire, and the very strong desire from everyone, is to allow him to redshirt, and then it be his probably be his job next year at this time. But kid is ultra talented, so we'll see how that goes. And but I think probably I would say probably 75% chance that he redshirts this year.
I know that 2023 is not supposed to be a banner year for Oklahoma football, still building. But at the same time, if Texas, who I believe to be the best team on paper, and I think that's pretty obvious to just about everyone, continues to figure out ways to screw up 3 or 4 games, then it's going to be a wide open race. I don't think that anybody else is beyond Oklahoma's grasp. And so there's still a Big 12 championship in play. I'm looking at I don't know if you had a chance to review the FPI that came out this week by ESPN. I'm going to toss it up here. And ESPN, and we can discuss what their formula is to a certain extent. I think the secret formula is difficult to pin down, but got a pretty good idea of what they're looking at here. And they've got Oklahoma at number 11 in the country. It's not bad.
Yeah, interesting. Well, we've sort of made light of this, obviously, over the last couple of years, and Mark, I haven't really had a big opportunity to look at it. To your point, but um, yeah, I think we've talked about these preseason top 25 polls to a certain degree, and a lot of it has to do with respect of the program early on in the season. A lot of it has to do with expectations, and I mean, Oklahoma is going to be nowhere near the top 10, right? But I think they'll probably be in the back half of the anywhere from probably 18 or 19 to 25 come the season, and whether that's warranted or not, who knows. Like Texas is going to be top 10. I mean, I think we all know that, right? And I think Texas is going to come into the season as the favorite, to win this conference. Whether it's warranted or not, there's a lot of there's a lot of question marks with TCU. There's some question marks with Kansas State in terms of what they bring back. So I think it's very. I think you made the point. If Texas slips up or they don't live up to these expectations as they typically have those
For the
expectations,
14th year in a row.
right? Then I think it's very, very, wide open this year, Mark. In a lot of ways, there's, year in and year out, it's always been Oklahoma as the preseason favorite, and they'll be in the top half for sure, but that's not it's not the same expectations that they've had year in and year out. So, yeah, I mean, I think Texas is very, very talented all across the board on both sides of the ball. Now, do they have the ability to consistently put it together over and over again throughout a season? Kind of remains to be seen. They had some outstanding games last year. Played really well against Oklahoma. Played really well against Alabama. But then they had some clunkers that they threw out there as well. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think it's like the league is as wide open as it's ever been. I mean, I think you've got Texas, you've got TCU, Kansas State, Baylor, and Oklahoma, kind of in that top half there, and then you've got some of those other ones like Texas Tech, Oklahoma State, and then obviously the newcomers to the league as well. I'm not sure where they will obviously kind of fall out in terms of we've talked about this as well. BYU probably being the most ready coming into the conference with this kind of schedule that they typically play every year, but it's very, very wide open this year, I believe.
Ryan says FPI is a joke. So I've reviewed this on the other team channels and team shows that we do since the FPI was released at sometime on Wednesday. And I certainly went through, and I wish among a lot of other categories in college football, I had kept some kind of journal as to all the fallacies and flaws in the FPI that I've noticed down through the years. Because this system is connected to the win probability that you see placed on every game. Oklahoma is playing Kansas, and it says that Oklahoma has a 78.2% chance of winning. Mm-hmm. That's exactly the same system that they use here, of which I have had issues with those win probabilities, mostly once they get into a game, that they are completely ridiculous at times, not all the time, of course, but I think it's a very interesting concept that they've projected the win probability for each side to start a game. And then as the course of the game and the situation and the score changes, it fluctuates in regards to the probability that a team is going to win. But I always bring this one up as the classic example. The Patriots-Jaguars AFC Championship game 5 years ago. Jacksonville had a 10-point lead with 10, 11 minutes left in the game, almost a full quarter left in the game. And for me, with Tom Brady in New England playing at home and everything we know about their history versus an upstart Jacksonville team, I almost think at this point, Jacksonville should be spotted a 10-point lead that is pretty much a 50-50 proposition. And they were giving Jacksonville like a 99.2% chance of winning with a 10-point lead with 10 or 11 minutes left, with all that time left on the clock. And I'm thinking, this is ridiculous.
Mhm.
Because the only reason I knew that, not that I'm checking the FPI during the game, it was during the highlights that night that was pointed out that, oh, New England came back. They had a 0.8% chance of winning this game. Why? That makes no sense. And I've seen that a number of times where it just gives this outrageous weight to having a lead in the game, especially in this day and age when we see 2-score leads wiped out in 3 or 4 minutes. The other prime example that I can think of is after Ohio State lost to Urban Meyer and Dwayne Haskins going into that next season, the FPI gave Ohio State a 6% chance of winning the Big Ten. Now, I don't know in what universe Ohio State's, and they play these simulations like 10,000 times to come up with these numbers. And I don't know in what universe Ohio State only wins the Big Ten 6 times out of 100 seasons. Like, I don't know where that's even possible.
Yeah.
I think like even 60 times is low. So for them to project anybody of that caliber to win their conference 6, I don't care who's left and who's come on. But anyway, I thought, and there's been a myriad of other times that I thought it was a bit ridiculous, but this is not a win projection. Now, they do have a win projection after they run this rating through the schedule, but just this is their projection on how good the teams are in order. So they are saying that Oklahoma is the 11th best team in the country. They're better than Tennessee, Oregon, Florida State, Utah. And then they run it through the schedule and come out with 9.7 wins and 2.8 losses.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd have to take a little bit to kind of regurgitate that, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm probably going to get slammed for this. For people watching this, I think it's a little high.
I think it is too.
I right now, and of course, this is just me spitballing here on April 20th. I think if Oklahoma can get to 8-4 this year, I think that's about where I see them. Now, certainly they have a higher ceiling than that, without a doubt. If some things materialize and a lot of these kids, a lot of these spots, really step up, they have probably I would say a 10-2, maybe 11-1 ceiling. But 8-4 is probably about where I see them at right now, with with how they finished last year.
And just for you math nerds that are figuring how can somebody go 9.7 and 2.8? Well, of course they can't, but even those numbers add up past 12 games. That's because they're projecting the possibility or probability, depending on the team, of going to the conference championship and then either winning or losing the conference championship game. So that's why it goes past 12 games for a number of teams, is there is a possibility. So if I'm doing the math right, 9.7, 2.8, that's 12.5. So they are giving Oklahoma a 50% chance of going to the Big 12 championship game. But 9.7 wins, practically a 10-2 season. That's pretty lofty. Like, I think they're capable of that. I think if everything falls into place, they can win a bunch of one-score games and just, things break right and everything's falling into place. Nobody gets hurt or nobody substantial gets hurt and all of that. Certainly, if you look at their schedule, they're capable of beating everyone. But they also just, this new Big 12 with all these new teams, they're going to run into somebody almost every week that's capable of beating them.
Yeah. No,
Just the
you're
probabilities of them only losing 2 games is slim.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the one thing that you look at, the schedule might be a little bit um, less hectic as it was a year ago, particularly when you look at the preseason. I say the preseason, the non-conference for Oklahoma with Arkansas State, SMU, and Tulsa have an opportunity to, but they went through unscathed last year. So yeah, I think there has to be quite in. They probably. I don't know that this team can go 12-0, even if everything falls into place the right way. But I think 10-2, 11-1 is possible. Um, you know, I hate to put floors on teams because it's so unpredictable what a floor could be. I mean, if you have a massive amount of injuries on both sides of the ball, I mean, a floor could very easily be 3-9 or 4-8 um, for a team. So it's so hard to predict. But I realistically, I'm with you. I think they're in anywhere from 8-4 to absolutely best case scenario 11-1, my opinion.
Yeah. Again, my point about the Big 12 is that, and this is going to be even more so going forward after Texas and Oklahoma leave, because they're the 2 programs that have the ability and the resources to dominate the league, and they're going to be gone, is that there is a definite hierarchy to every conference where you can look at one of the best teams in one of the other conferences and say, these are the definite wins. There might be one definite loss. And when I say definite, nothing's definite, but near definite. And then there's just a couple toss-up games. In this conference, it seems like almost every game's a toss-up. Every game's like 50-50, 60-40. A ton of them are, until we start to see week 4, week 5. Okay, West Virginia is not that good. Iowa State's not that good.
Mm-hmm.
TCU's fallen off a ton, or whatever the results show us after 4 or 5 weeks. But going into it, my goodness, outside of Texas and teams like Oklahoma and Oklahoma State being on the top end of that, but man, this conference is mighty unpredictable.
It really is, Mark. I'm completely with you. It's very unpredictable. I mean, just look at last year. Who would have expected TCU to go play for a national championship, and they did. And who would have? I mean, I think a lot of people, including myself, didn't really think that they would beat Michigan, but they did. So who knows? There could be one of those teams that no one expects to come out and have just a fantastic season this year. So yeah, the unpredictability is very high.
Gash Blitz is awfully optimistic. The floor is 8-4. Do we understand what a floor is?
Yeah.
All right, Gash Blitz. Of course, it's your opinion.
Yeah. Well, and I think, I mean, it's the same way at a lot of these blue blood schools, but I think with Oklahoma, like fans expect greatness, every year, and so I think that's where you get a lot of these. I mean, you'll continue to get a lot of these same predictions from various fans, across the Sooner State here. That last year was just an aberration, and this is a team that will, be back to the way that they have before. So we'll see. We'll see a lot of things to hash out and talk through until you get to that point. But yeah, there's a lot of ifs, I think, surrounding this team to get to that expectation that we have here on the screen.
Yeah, and I do think that for the blue bloods and the elites, there can be a difference between what the standard is and for a Florida State, Oklahoma, Texas a couple of years ago, and even now to a certain extent, where you have national championship pedigree and history and conference championship history, you don't back off of that standard. That's still the standard. You're still putting up a standard of excellence as being, this is who we are. We compete heavily for conference championships. We win them most of the time. If we're Oklahoma, we compete for national championships, but that's not where we are right now. So that's our standard, but our expectations for this season really can't be that.
Right. Yep, I agree.
Oklahoma Sooners Live here every week, folks. Typically on Wednesday. Sometimes we've got to switch it up because we've got schedules to coordinate. So we would encourage you to please subscribe and hit the bell for the notifications to get that. We will not drive you nuts with notifications like every day, 8 times per day. It's basically going to come the once per week when we set up the live stream for the show. All right, Jason, enjoy the spring game.
Absolutely. We'll do.
And we will catch you and everyone else back here next week.